released, I believe, last November, called Lincoln's Battle with God, A President's Struggle with Faith and What It Meant for America. Stephen, welcome to the program.
It's good to be with you.
The title, Lincoln's Battle with God, is, by the way, this book is excellent. I shouldn't even have to say that. You're a New York Times best-selling author, but it actually is even poignant in many spots. But the title is provocative because even people who know very little about American presidents know the names George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, and regardless of how little they know about Abraham Lincoln, they know his name is connected with one thing: war, the Civil War. And so Lincoln's battle with God kind of turns that assumption on its head, and you go, what? Lincoln had a battle with God? What is all that about? Why don't you give us a brief overview of what this book is exploring?
Well, Lincoln, of course, is almost the symbol of the American soul in a sense. You know, you read his words, his great speeches, his poetry. He really has captured the heart of America, and for many people, he's the symbol of America. But, we tend to put either an atheistic smear over our past, or sometimes we Christians can overstate the Christian influences or the nature of the Christianity in our history. And I believe that what Abraham Lincoln offered to his nation at a time of crisis really comes out of his own battle with faith. He was born to parents who were very caught up in the frontier revivals of the early 1800s. He was turned off by that, the emotionalism and the excesses that sometimes were there. He went through a period in his early life when he was very much the village atheist. He read Thomas Paine and Volney and Gibbon and some of these other secularist authors, and he rejected Christianity entirely and criticized Jesus publicly, called him names I can't use on the air. Well, in time, though, he began making a slow, steady journey back to the faith that we see when he's in the White House, and especially in that great second inaugural address, which is, of course, on the wall of Lincoln Memorial. So I think it's Lincoln battling for faith through his griefs, through the pain, through the horrors of the Civil War, that causes him to sort of dig the well with which he, feeds, so to speak, inspires the rest of the country. And it's a story that's often not told because we either have a perfectly Christian Lincoln in some presentations, or we have a completely secular Lincoln. Most scholars treat him as a completely atheistic person. And the truth is this amazing journey throughout his life. So that's what I wanted to capture. And by the way, one more little thing, I thought that would reach to a lot of people today who are in a journey of faith, that be encouraged that some of the greatest men of our history had lifelong battles to the faith they ultimately arrived at.
Talk a little bit about the, quote, infidel phase of his life. You've got your chapter 3 is called The Infidel. I suppose that most Americans would just be shocked to know that there was this time, this period. How old was he? How long did that period last, and what brought him out of it?
Well, it's a great question. Lincoln began rejecting any form of Christianity when he rejected his parents' revivalistic version of Christianity. Now, this is not like just what we know today. This did have some excesses and very much frontier religion. Sometimes people were drunk and claiming religion. I mean, there were great things that happened in that revival, but he certainly was turned off to the excesses. And then one of the things that we most remember him for, and most celebrate him for, became sort of the path to this atheistic phase, and that is that he engaged in that famous, project of self-education, where he would walk miles to borrow a book. He taught himself to read, basically. He read everything he could get his hands on. Well, it made him an exceptional man and an exceptional mind, but a lot of what he ended up reading was sort of the religiously skeptical literature of his time. Again, Thomas Paine and Edward Gibbon, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and others of that ilk. Robert Burns, for example, he liked Robert Burns' poetry, but Robert Burns was also very much went through his phase against Christianity. And so in time, he became adept at making an argument against Christianity and against the Bible and against Jesus in particular. He would walk through town with the Bible and just challenge people to make a declaration from Scripture that he couldn't counter, that he couldn't dismiss or disprove, so to speak. And this went on for almost a decade. And he was known as the village atheist. His friends remembered him from this atheistic period as being very angry, very harsh, picking religious fights like we sometimes see people do. And then the turning happened in a progression. He married Mary Todd Lincoln. She was a devoted Episcopalian. That at least got him to some degree reconnected to church. But unfortunately in Lincoln's life, his real spiritual turnings came in times of horrible grief. And the first one happened around 1950 when he lost his first son. His son died from a disease they called consumption. It was horrible, horrible. Lincoln suffered depression all his life already. And so this threw him in a tailspin. And fortunately, a Presbyterian pastor in Springfield began to minister to him. And this began a turning that led to, I think, about a decade and a half later, a man who really did affirm his faith in God and God's rulership over the nation. And that was the critical point that helped him, I think, be an exceptional president.
George Washington, I think it was in his farewell address. You would probably know, but he mentioned that the two pillars that were necessary for political prosperity in this nation were religion and morality. And he said that no man could call himself a patriot if he tried to undermine either of those two great pillars. So a lot of, especially evangelical Christians, look at statements like that and we say, well, there it is. America, always has been a Christian nation, and the move away from that, or at least the push away from that, is a modern thing. But is it true to say that that America has, in some ways, always wrestled with the role of religion? We have the new atheists. Is it true to say that the new atheists are not so new when it comes to America, that there's always been sort of this, and I'm not denying what George Washington said or the foundations of this country, but this struggle in America to come to grips with these two strains of thought?
Well, I appreciate the question so much because that's one of the big themes I like to develop. If we believe that our entire history was thoroughly Christian until, let's just say 1960, and then the whole thing just fell apart in the revolutions of the 60s, then we will despair with where we are today. But if we understand instead the truth, which is that in every generation of Americans, and of course not just Americans, other places in the world, there were constant struggles of faith, constant battles with skepticism, atheism, deism, Unitarianism, unbiblical versions of faith and derivations of Christianity. Then we will not be that discouraged by the battles we're fighting. You said it just right. The new atheists are nothing new. In fact, they are recycling the same arguments that Abraham Lincoln read when he was, probably sitting somewhere with his feet up the wall. Yeah, that's the way he always read, reading arguments against Christianity. He was reading what Christopher Hitchens would have been saying until he passed away recently. He was reading what Dawkins and those guys say, minus some of the scientific observations. This stuff is not new. Our founding fathers wrestled with it. Some of them succumbed to it, a very few. Every generation has wrestled with it, and the encouragement of that is that it actually makes us better, stronger, better articulators of Christian truth when we have to battle these things. So we shouldn't be discouraged by the battles of faith in our generation. We should welcome them and realize that we're simply walking in the ways of our fathers, having to fight these intellectual battles in order to win broader cultural battles. And that's exactly what happened in Lincoln's life. It's what happened in Washington's life, and 100 other founders that we can talk about.
Stephen, you talk in your chapter, The Haunting of Graves, about how the Civil War, the river of blood from Shiloh and Antietam and from Gettysburg, how that crushing burden weighed heavily upon him. What impact did the war itself have on the development of his faith journey?
It's a great question you guys are asking. If I had sent you questions in advance, you would have asked these questions because it's just one of the most important things ever. Lincoln goes into the presidency a man who believes in God, but as we can tell from his first inaugural address, he's also a man who believes that human events are very much under human control. he says to the Confederacy, "Into your hands, my departed brothers, is this matter of civil war." He believes the war is in the hands of men. Well, of course it is to some extent, but it's interesting. 4 years later, in the second inaugural address, Lincoln has abandoned that conclusion. And during that period of those 4 years, he has seen such devastation. He has seen events so much out of his control as the commander-in-chief of the Union forces. He has seen battles lost by generals who stayed too long at coffee. He has seen he can't get troops to move. He can't get generals to fight. He absolutely is not in control. At one point, he said of one general in frustration, "If he's not going to use the army, I would like to borrow it." I mean, he's just frustrated. And he finally comes to the conclusion that God is involved in this war, that God has visited this war as judgment upon the nation. And that's the conclusion we see revealed in his second inaugural address. He says the war came, and God is using this war to cleanse our nation. And so Lincoln's faith matured during those years. He walked the White House floors in the wee hours of the morning, grieving over what we now know to be over 700,000 casualties. Our numbers have been a bit light. Historians have revised the numbers. And 700,000 deaths. And Lincoln bore that burden. He was already a man who battled depression all his life, largely because of the deaths of loved ones. Now he was dealing with just the devastation of a generation. And he came to the conclusion that this was a work of God, and it had to be assuaged by the nation being a righteous nation. And that's the important transformation that happened in his life during those first 4 years of war.
We're talking to Stephen Mansfield, New York Times bestselling author, also a respected voice on religion and culture in America. His book, Lincoln's Battle with God, is what we're discussing. Stephen, I want to say, as I mentioned at the beginning of our interview with you, that this is just an extraordinary book. I really recommend this. There were parts in this book where I literally had tears in my eyes. I mean, the moments, some of the moments are that poignant. And I think what does that is the suffering that you are able to portray Lincoln enduring. I mean, the personal travail of this man. We sometimes make our presidents cartoonish. This is a man who's a very deep personality, and I don't think it's not a self-help book. I want to stress that. But do you think that people who struggle, for example, with depression or struggle with the existence of God or struggle with the burdens that they're bearing in life, and again, it's not a self-help book, but do you think they would be encouraged by reading about a man that so many Americans respect, regardless of how much they know about Abraham Lincoln, seeing a titan going through this kind of struggle? Do you think that would be helpful on that level?
There's just no question about it. I have a real irritation with what I call the statue version of history, which is that everyone we study in the past we present as though they fell perfect from the womb, never had a bad hair day. Whenever they dropped their toast, the jam always was up, facing up when it landed. In other words, nothing ever went badly. And the reality is that most of the people we revere as great became great because they had great personal battles. And so part of the reason that I read history, part of the reason I urge other people to read and study history, is so they'll understand that their battles are not that unique, that they can be surmounted, and that they are not alone. My two main subjects in historical biography have been Abraham Lincoln and Winston Churchill. They both suffered horrible depression. They suffered horribly. Winston Churchill, even when he was Prime Minister of England, would not stay in a room with a balcony on it because he was afraid a depression might hit him, and he would throw himself off. That's while he was leading the Western world towards victory over the enemies. Lincoln, very much the same way. Lincoln's mother died when he was 9. He helped make the coffin and then put her into the ground. His sister died when he was 16. Other relatives died. His first love died within months of him falling in love with her. I could go on and on. He was a man with a deep, deep pool of depression. His friends said he dripped melancholy while he walked. Now, I lecture in a lot of college universities. I look out there, I see the 18, 19, 20-year-old young person who they want their lives to be meaningful, but they battle depression, or they just have a sad nature, or maybe they're not physically attractive, and as this culture defines it. Lincoln was known to be horrible. They called him the ape. And all of that they find in Lincoln's life, and then they find out he changed the course of history. Well, it's an encouragement. It makes me feel like I'm not alone, makes me feel like my flaws can actually become some of the strength of greatness in my life. It makes me believe that I can accomplish more than I had ever dreamed, or my culture or maybe my family tells me. So that's the power of history. You read these flawed people, and then you see them change lives and be magnificent souls in the world. And I think their sufferings actually helped fashion them in that way. So you're absolutely correct. All history in one sense should not be written as a self-help guide. But on the other hand, all history is a self-help guide in the sense that it helps us know humanity, know what humanity can surmount, and thus know that we can do it.
Stephen, if we run the clock all the way up to that final fateful night in Ford's Theater, I have two questions to ask you about that. One, as far as the evidence can tell us, where was President Lincoln on his spiritual journey? How far had he gone, as far as we can tell, near the end? And then say something about the amazing final words as recorded years later by his wife, Mary.
Yes, those final words are fascinating, but let me answer your first question first. I have to wear two hats as I answer this question in two ways. If you're asking Stephen Mansfield as a Christian and as a man who can sort of sense, maybe, I don't mean mystically, but look at the man's life and see where he was heading, I think Abraham Lincoln was a man who had made a slow journey towards Christianity, had come to belief in Jesus Christ, had come to belief in the Christian gospel, had come to belief in the Bible as an inspired guide, the Word of God, but had not solidified that in terms of baptism or church membership. He never did join a church, etc. I believe that John Wilkes Booth's Derringer Ball interrupted that final phase. If you ask me as a historian, I can't confirm as much as I've even said. He never said much about Jesus publicly. That was kind of the manner of the time. We have no written affirmation of his faith in Jesus Christ as the Son of God. In other words, if I'm being strict scholar, I can't prove much of what I've just said. I just know that Abraham Lincoln believed in God, believed he ruled in the affairs of men, and sought to please him in office. I can't confirm the things that evangelicals like myself need to hear coming out of the mouth of a man to believe that he's born again. So that's the problem. That's always been the problem in Lincoln studies. But your second question is the one that probably gives us the most hope from the perspective of those of us who are Christians and hope that he was. And that is that on the last night of Lincoln's life, many of your listeners probably watched the Lincoln movie that Spielberg made, and remember that there was a carriage ride during the day, Mary and Abraham, and they began a conversation about where they would go after the war. And that night in the booth at Ford's Theater, while the play was going on, they weren't that interested in it. They continued that conversation, and Lincoln said things like, "We will not go back to Springfield. We will go abroad so I can rest." And then he said, "I should very much like to go to Palestine." That's what he called it at the time. "I should very much like to go to Jerusalem." And there was a pause, and they talked a little bit more, and then he said, "Yes, I should like to go to the Holy City and walk in the footsteps of the Savior." And those were within the last 2 or 3 words he ever spoke in this life. At that moment, John Wilkes Booth fired a Derringer ball into his brain. Now, that's a very well-substantiated version of events. There's no question that is what we were told by Mary Lincoln afterwards.
Stephen, yes. I'm sorry. I am so sorry to interrupt you at this point.
No, that's fine.
Because we are out of time. Maybe we'll have to have you back on just to have you finish that story. But I want to commend you again and commend to our listeners the book by Stephen Mansfield, Lincoln's Battle with God. I encourage people to pick up a copy of this book. It will do you loads of good. Stephen, thank you so much for being with us.